It's state fair time and campaign silly season has nearly begun. We talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the weekly program about state government and politics and how it might just affect you. Joining me this week on Capitol View is Charlie Wheeler, Director of Public Affairs Reporting at University of Illinois Springfield. Welcome, Charlie.
Hi, Bruce. It's always nice to be here.
And conspicuously absent is our second guest. There's a lot of stuff going on, what with the fair and with politics, and so let's just dive right into it.
Well, and we didn't put an empty chair there to signify it.
That's not Clint Eastwood or anybody else. That's just an empty chair.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're non-political in that sense.
Non-political. Some interesting things said today by Governor Bruce Rushton, and some interesting actions taken. Number one, he has opened his checkbook. Shocking, but he has, saying he's giving $1 million to Erica Harold, the Republican candidate for Attorney General, as well as $2 million to House Republicans to ensure that perhaps he has some GOP help coming up for the next year if in fact he is reelected. But he's given more than just money, at least in the case of Erica Harold. Today he has said that he has an expectation, at least, that Erica Harold, if elected, will prosecute Mike Madigan, House Speaker. Charlie, is this fun and games? Is this serious? Is this just nuts or somewhere in between?
Well, it's like you said in the opening, this is like the campaign silly season. Although in the case of Governor Rauner, he has this fixation on Michael Madigan. And I've said in many places, at many times, he sees Mike Madigan as the embodiment of all evil. So his hand-picked candidate for Attorney General, Erica Harold, will prosecute him. Now the problem is that in Illinois, the Attorney General does really not have the authority to prosecute anybody. At the state and local level, it's the state's attorneys in the various counties around the state. And at the federal level, it's the U.S. attorneys. And attorneys general for Illinois have never prosecuted crimes, with the exception of instances in which a state's attorney in a small county with a particular challenging situation might ask for help from the attorney general, because the attorney general does have people who are very good at criminal prosecution
and in
on
fact,
staff.
That's happened.
And they lend that. Oh, sure.
In Logan County, for example, the Beeson killings a few years back, the Logan County prosecutor, John Wright, very capable gentleman, very capable lawyer, but small shop, and so the AG came in and helped out. But go ahead.
Yeah, and that's one of the roles. But basically, the Attorney General has two main functions. One is to represent the state in all kinds of legal actions, and the second, and attorneys general over the years have developed this, is to be sort of the common law protector of individual citizens who are being harmed by corporations, by polluters, by scam artists. And there's a long history of being a consumer advocate. In the case of Lisa Madigan, the current Attorney General, being very much trying to beef up the Freedom of Information Act so that, well, you roll your eyes, but it's a lot better than it was.
Yeah, we can talk about that. But
but that's one of the things she's committed, going after polluters. That was Bill Scott's big thing, was to go after pluters, as he used to call them. Yeah, and so this has been their focus, and they've left the law enforcement up to the people whose job it is to carry out those duties. So I think it's kind of a stretch to expect that Ms. Harold, if she's elected, would suddenly file some kind of criminal charges against Mike Madigan. And just as a practical matter, in the real world, consider Patrick Fitzgerald, who was the U.S. Attorney in Chicago for a number of years, who was behind the convictions of Rod Blagojevich, behind the conviction of George Ryan, former governors. Do you, in your wildest imagination, assume that Patrick Fitzgerald said, "Oh, Mike Madigan, hands off, I don't want to get near him," and didn't take a look at Madigan, careful look, and didn't find anything?
Well, I mean, U.S. attorneys and folks who bring big guns to Africa both have something in common. They're both after big game.
That's right.
and Madigan would be one. But nonetheless, when Lisa Madigan, when Blagojevich was governor, did make life a bit difficult for him. She started poking around, and Fitzgerald told her to back off. Couldn't the next Attorney General conceivably do that same sort of thing?
My recollection is what she was looking at was irregularities in the hiring process, not necessarily criminal offenses, but violations of the civil law. And as a matter of fact, Fitzgerald told her to back off, and in his note he said that he's investigating endemic corruption and hiring practices. It was some such phrase. And it was and it was focused on hiring. And then when the cards were all out on the table, you realize all the charges against Rod Blagojevich, none of them had anything to do with hiring.
Yeah, it was something else.
It was like you said, it was bigger game.
It was bigger game, but badgering is badgering, and whether it's criminal or not, I mean, inspector generals, auditor generals spend all their time, poking around and
when they find something that's a criminal offense, they refer it.
They refer it
to a state's attorney or U.S. attorney. I thought it was interesting too that the governor is giving money to the House Republicans. I don't believe he gave any to the Senate Republicans today. Now, maybe that's in recognition of the fact that it's literally impossible for the Senate Republicans to elect a majority in November. If Republican Senate candidates win every race in which they're entered, they still would not have the 30 votes that would be needed to form a majority. So he's focusing on the House, I guess, where he's hopes somehow to be able to elect 60 Republicans to the House.
Sure. I mean, jumping back to Harold, just before we let her go for a second, I'm not sure that anybody's asked Erica Harold, are you going to be prosecuting Mike Madigan if elected? Are you aware of any kind of a statement on that regard by her?
No, but this comment was made on the morning of the day that we're taping this, and so presumably by the time our viewers see this, Ms. Harold would have responded. And
one would hope so, yeah.
Yeah, and would have said something.
Yeah, I mean, because I'm not an expert on legalistic ethics, but I would wonder about the ethics perhaps of somebody, if you elect me, I am going to prosecute Mike Madigan or the man on the moon. In other words, it doesn't really matter who you're going after. If you've already made up your mind that you're going to, quote unquote, lock them up as soon as you get elected, what might any kind of a legalistic ethics expert have to say about that?
They would probably not be pleased, but on the other hand, if we look at the way campaigning in this nation has developed in recent years, you can say all kinds of stuff that maybe someone who is a strict ethicist would say, you really shouldn't be talking that way. Yeah. And the masses love it, or they seem to.
Yeah, and yours is a good point. I mean, it's almost like a page out of the Trump handbook to a degree. She's going to prosecute Mike Madigan. Echoes of lock her up that Donald Trump made on the campaign.
Lock him up.
So,
goodness.
Well, and back to the point about the legislature. I mean, the blue wave is coming. Everybody knows it. That's a given, or is it? What are the chances that money from the governor could put the Republicans over the top in the House? I mean, it is going to be a challenging midterm. That's what the pros are saying, and the maps are the maps.
Yeah, I would say it's a stretch. It's going to be really tough for the Republicans to elect a majority. They've had difficulties of their own. Probably the most notable one recently was when one of the rising stars suddenly had to drop out of public life because of allegations that he behaved in an incredibly boorish manner towards an ex-girlfriend.
Yeah, catfishing. Catfish Sauer was his name, or?
No, his name was Nick Sauer, and earlier this week, he finally resigned from the ballot. He had resigned from the House last week, and then he finally filed the petition with the State Board of Elections saying, I'm removing my candidacy. And now the officials in Lake County and in Cook County, the Republican officials who have, what would you say, jurisdiction over his legislative district, will have to find somebody to replace him on the ballot. I think they have until, the 20th of August to get it done.
Sure. And it was kind of a classic hypocritical move by a politician. I mean, Mr. Sauer, former representative, had been involved, I believe, in some sort of effort on the Me Too movement we're trying to.
Well, he was on the anti-discrimination task force in the House.
Yeah. Go figure.
Well, what can you say? That's the kind of thing, as I've said in other venues, that to me, it's as somebody my age, my generation, that kind of behavior is just unimaginable.
Sure.
Of course, back when I was his age, we didn't have the internet either. So,
thank Lord.
Yes, yes.
That stuff never does go away. I want to shift gears just for a second, if we could, and talk about the recent gun violence in Chicago. That's got a lot of headlines. It's got a lot of attention, and deservedly so. Neither candidate, at least to this point that I'm aware of, has made much of an issue about this gun violence, keeping in mind that it's early on. We have a history in Illinois of Chicago violence entering into politics. One example of that was Pat Quinn's neighborhood recovery initiative, I believe, of 2010, in which he pumped something like $40 million or so just in October before the campaign to fight violence in Chicago. Turns out a lot of the money was wasted, ill spent. It wasn't particularly well done. Again,
but on the other hand, he won the election, as I recall.
Yes, he did win the election. So $40 million for violence efforts might go a long way, at least in the voting booth. What might happen here? I mean, in the back of my mind, I'm almost thinking that neither candidate here has a real claim, at least so far, to being I am the savior of this. I'm the bright person on the pedestal that can solve this. Rauner has been in office for 4 years. It remains a problem. Pritzker has been tied, rightly or wrongly, to the tired old liberal politics that hasn't been able to solve this. Do either one of them have good answers? And if neither one of them has good answers, do they even talk about it?
Well, I think they're talking about it. And it, not so much Pritzker, but Rauner has attempted to shift this back. It's Rahm's fault, Rahm Emanuel, the mayor. It's Madigan's fault because he's been in charge of the government for 35 years, that kind of stuff. The difficulty is, at least in my mind, to be able to solve these kinds of issues is going to require a lot of expenditure because one of the underlying themes seems to be a lot of young men who don't have jobs, don't have bright prospects for the future, and they get caught up in this violence, and their identity, instead of saying, I'm going to go to college, I'm going to be a doctor or whatever, their identity is, I'm a member of this particular gang. That's how I derive my worth as a human being, as a member of the gang. And that's really tough to break. You need better education, better schools, and programs that are geared specifically to turning these guys around. You also need job opportunities, better job training, and it's also a factor that guns are so readily available.
Sure.
Now, the Second Amendment people say, well, if everybody had a gun, we wouldn't have a problem, because when the bad guy pulls out the gun, I'm the good guy and I'll shoot him. That's an oversimplification, but they believe that if people were armed, there'd be less of these difficulties. But so much of the violence in Chicago is because of people who are armed. I'm in one gang, you're in another gang. You said something nasty to me on Facebook, again, social media, so I'm going to shoot you. I shoot you. Your brother comes and shoots me, and my brother shoots him. It's this back and forth retaliation among these feuding gangs. One of the ironies is when I started as a reporter, like, 30-some, more than that, 50 years ago, there were very well-organized street gangs in Chicago, and they had a hierarchical structure. There were people on top who controlled things, and you didn't have this kind of violence. Now, the people on top have died or they've gone to jail, and you have gangs that, instead of organizing on the basis of an entire huge neighborhood, or maybe just a couple blocks. And
it's more splintered.
It's very much more splintered. The drug trade propels a lot of it, the easy availability of firearms, not necessarily legally, but firearms. Somebody will go down to Mississippi or somewhere and buy a ton of guns, bring them back to Chicago and peddle them on the street. And you have this whole culture of I don't have anything to live for other than being a good gang member. And if I get shot, so what? I think there's that mentality. That's what you got to fight against. That's what you got to try and turn around. And if there were jobs, and I think someone suggested a $15 an hour wage would help.
Yeah, that was, there was a recent, just the other day, Gary McDougall, who heads the governor's task force on social service issues. I can't recall the right name or the exact name of the task force now, but he had an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal just the other day about this subject in the wake of the violence. And not surprisingly, a lot of it could be read as a hit piece against Mayor Rahm Emanuel. But if you read it closely, at least I think so, it talks about a lot of the things that you've talked about, which is the social service nets, the agencies haven't been effective. They haven't worked together to the extent that they should. Well, whose fault is that? Is that the mayor's fault, or is that the state's fault, or I mean, it seems to me that the governor can't really claim I'm running the world's greatest social services net here in the state of Illinois when we had the budget impasse, which was extremely harmful on that level. Bruce Rauner cut funding for ceasefire in 2015, which has been a fairly lauded effort to a street level effort that gets away from government and actually has some former gang members trying to convince folks in their neighborhood that shooting each other isn't a good idea. By the same token, Rahm Emanuel cut funding for ceasefire in 2013. The other point that McDougall makes is that what you said. He had talked to some folks and determined that a $15 an hour job, according to the folks who are causing the problems themselves, or the folks who are close to the folks who are causing some of these problems, $15 an hour is enough to get me off the street corner and into out of a life of crime and into a good job that might have some prospects. It'll keep $15 an hour, keeps me out of trouble. Not so interested at $8.75 or whatever the wage is now. And Democrats have pushed for a $15 an hour minimum wage. Bruce Rauner, I think, infamously endorsed the idea of the $15 minimum wage during one of his first addresses to the legislature, and then he called it a phased approach, which provoked open laughter on the floor of the assembly. So I guess what I thought was kind of interesting was this Wall Street Journal piece, if you read it properly, casts blame to everybody, and this is the governor's own person talking.
Oh yeah, and I think there's another problem in Chicago. The people who do this, the people who do the killing, are known. It's not like somebody dropped down from the sky, shot somebody, and disappeared. But the folks who know, for whatever reason, don't feel able to tell the police, well, Wheeler is the one who did the shooting. Part of it is fear, because if the word gets out, then Wheeler's friends will come and get them. Or the other thing is they don't really trust the police. The experience, particularly in the minority communities on the west side, the south side, African American communities, Hispanic communities, is the police are not really your friends. They're there, they hassle you, they give you a rough time. Some of them are corrupt, they shake you down. You can deal drugs, but you got to cut me in on it. And I would say that the feeling, say, on the west side of Springfield towards the police department, the Springfield Police Department is very, very different than the feeling on the west side of Chicago towards the Chicago Police Department. And until you can fix that, you're not going to be able to solve these other problems.
I think the Laquan Mcdonald case is a case study in that, and also so much more. I think that Laquan Mcdonald goes a long way toward explaining why a lot of folks in Chicago don't trust the police, and they don't trust the mayor. First, the Mr. McDonald, 17, I believe, gunned down in cold blood in the street. And you look at the video, and it's just undeniable, and it is absolutely 100% contrary to the official account that was released to the press thereafter. The press also failed. The mainstream press did not do, in my estimation, what the mainstream press should have been doing in terms of truthing that out. And instead, it fell to a somewhat independent journalist to actually figure out, request the autopsy report and say, wait a minute, this guy didn't get shot once, accounts, there's more than a dozen holes in them,
Yeah.
and that was contrary to the account. The state failed Laquan Mcdonald. He'd been in foster care and was subject to some degree of apparently, allegedly abusive treatment. The Attorney General failed in this case. Did not help in prying loose the video, the damning video, which without the release of that we wouldn't even be having murder trials.
Well, it was finally released under pressure
by a federal judge.
From the media.
Well, but it was
pushing for it.
Yeah, but it was the media pushing for it. I can't remember the name of the reporter. It was not for the two big newspapers, and it was a federal judge. It was nobody from the state of Illinois. And so it's understandable, I think, to a large degree, why, if you lived in one of these neighborhoods, and there's lots of good folks who do, why you'd keep your mouth shut and you'd be afraid. And by some estimations, the percentages of homicides that are solved in some of these neighborhoods is something south of 10%. I mean, that's some.
It's really poor.
It's 90% of the folks who are killing people are getting away, and there's no easy. You blame the community. All right, they might have some culpability here. You blame the city. They probably have some culpability. It's kind of everybody's fault. And
it's going to take a long time to resolve too. It's not something you can do overnight. You can't pass a law and make all this better, make it go away.
No.
And you have just the changing neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. The fact that the increasing gentrification of neighborhoods in Chicago has forced poor, low-income people out of their homes to make room for what's the fashionable term these days, the millennials. It used to be the yuppies, now they're the millennials. And so there's a talk and a movement trying to get rent controls in the city of Chicago. And I think Democratic candidate Pritzker has endorsed that as a way to preserve some of these communities so that you don't get forced to go and live in a worse neighborhood and try and find housing and get gouged by landlords so that we can make room for this gentrification.
Sure. And these are all serious issues, I think. And I don't think anybody would disagree that these are serious issues. And one would hope that they get discussed in a serious sense during the gubernatorial campaign. I mean, we've had our fun and games to some extent. We've had the toilets following Pritzker around on the campaign trail. We've had the name calling. We've had the brickbats. I'm not naive enough to believe that that's going to stop. But it would be nice to have a reasoned, serious discussion between the candidates about what really needs to be done without the animus that we so often see, because this is serious stuff.
Yeah, but I don't see that happening. Yeah. Not in the current environment, the political environment. It's not like back in the day, and again, I'm dating myself, when you could have people who are on opposite sides of an issue sit and have a reasonable, rational conversation and listen to each other and learn and move things forward. That's the way the General Assembly used to work.
Yeah,
40 years ago.
Well, again, the campaigns are going to get 2-3 weeks from now. We're going to be in the thick of it, and hopefully, cross fingers, we'll see more serious, thoughtful political discourse than we have in the past. I'm with you. I'm not holding my breath on it.
And I might win the lottery too if I buy a ticket.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about deep fried something on a stick. The fair is in session, and it's not what it once was. At least from a political sense. The former vice president is going to be visiting Springfield next Thursday. You'd hope he'd stand up, on a lawn underneath a tent, mopping his brow in the humid, hot weather, and speak without a microphone, old-timey wise, to as many folks as who want to show up. Instead, he's at the Crown Plaza Hotel, and tickets are sold out. How much has the fair changed in terms of a political platform for folks?
I have to confess ignorance on that.
Okay.
And the reason is I haven't been to the fair in years. I probably shouldn't say
You're like
this
Mike Madigan
public.
Then.
I think the last time I went was probably more than that. It was probably 15, 20 years ago when my son's band played at one of the beer tents.
Okay.
And when I was at the paper, it always worked that my vacation came at the time of the state fair. So I was not here. I was in northern Wisconsin.
You fled Illinois from the fair. Okay.
Yeah. But from what I've read, things are a lot less important at the fair. Part of it is social media.
Sure.
You don't have that necessity to bring people together to rally. I mean, you can do it with tweets, you can do it with posts on Facebook, you can do it with Instagram and all the rest of that stuff.
Which doesn't enlighten folks very much.
But I would argue the political speeches that I saw in other venues in the state fair weren't really that enlightening either.
It's no better live than it is on Facebook. Okay. Well, I guess I have nothing against the fair. It's a fine organization. It's a fun time. But I'd like to see a few more politicians. I know that they did move to limit, I think, the number of participants in the annual parade that they would have, and I'm not sure that's a bad idea, except for you don't get as much candy thrown at you when there's fewer participants. So,
oh no, I'm not knocking the fair. I think it's a wonderful thing, and I would, were I in the legislature, I would vote to sustain its funding. I would vote money for capital improvements because I think it's an asset. I think it's a showcase for Illinois agriculture.
Yeah.
But it's just not my cup of tea.
Well, fair enough, and I think your point about a capital program for the fairgrounds is perhaps long overdue. Other states have managed to do this. I know that New York State, within the last 5 years or so, spent a boatload of money overhauling its dilapidated fairgrounds, based on the premise that when we're done fixing all this up, we'll turn it over to a private operator who will then make sure everything runs swimmingly from here on out, and it will never cost taxpayers another dime. I'm not sure how that turned out, but I know one thing: we're out of time. And so thanks for joining us this week on Capitol View, and we'll see you again soon.